7 times Nora Daly stood before the matrimonial board of Redbow humiliated. 7 times a respectable man looked at her fire-scarred hands and rigid spine, then quickly walked away. Out here, a woman without a husband was a liability. They called her unmarriageable, ruined, cursed by bad luck. Until a heavy shadow blocked the saloon doors. A mountain man smelling of wood smoke and old blood who survived the high ridges where outlaws froze. He didn't want a soft, weeping bride. He wanted a survivor. Dust coated the floorboards of the mercantile thick enough to hold the footprints of every man who had walked away from Nora Daly. Amos Weaver stood by the pickle barrels, his hat clutched to his chest like a shield. He was the 7th. A corn farmer from the lower valley, Amos had a weak chin and a desperate need for a woman to churn his butter and bear his children. Yet as he looked at Nora, his gaze darted everywhere but her face. He looked at the flour sacks. He looked at the rusted tin cups hanging from the ceiling. He looked at the raised, white skin wrapping around Nora's left forearm, the burn scars that vanished beneath the collar of her faded gingham dress. "It just ain't fitting, Nora." Amos muttered, his voice barely louder than the buzz of horseflies against the windowpane. "My mother needs a woman with strong, whole hands for the harvest, and you, well, the fire." Nora did not blink. She kept her chin level. Her hands, the very hands he insulted, rested quietly over her apron. They were not weak. They chopped wood. They hauled water. They had dragged her father out of a burning homestead 3 years ago, though it hadn't been enough to save him. But Amos didn't care about the strength it took to survive a fire. He only cared about the ugly truth left behind. "I understand, Amos," Nora said. Her voice was flat, hollowed out by practice. Amos nodded, relieved he wouldn't have to face a woman's tears. He turned and practically bolted out the door, the bell jingling a harsh, mocking tune in his wake. Nora stood alone in the quiet gloom of the shop. 7 men. Over 2 years, the town council had arranged 7 meetings to find her a match, a desperate charity to rid themselves of an orphaned spinster. First was the blacksmith who wanted a pretty thing to show off at church. Second was the schoolteacher who found her silence unnerving. 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, all practical men who took one look at her scarred flesh and her fierce, unsmiling eyes and decided she was broken goods. A woman marked by tragedy was a woman who would bring bad luck to a harvest. She turned back to the counter, picking up her small basket. 1/2 pound of oats, a tin of coffee. She counted out her coins, well aware of the pitying stare of Widow Higgins behind the register. "Don't you mind him, dear?" Widow Higgins offered her voice, dripping with the kind of syrup that made Nora's teeth ache. "God has a plan for everyone, even the afflicted. Ring up the oats, Martha." Nora didn't have the energy for politeness. Outside, the sun was a hammer. Heat radiated from the hard-packed dirt of Redbow's main street, baking the smell of horse manure and stale beer into the air. Nora walked with purpose. If she walked fast, the men lounging outside the saloon wouldn't have time to throw their jagged little jokes. If she kept her eyes on the distant tree line, she wouldn't have to see the smug faces of the town girls walking arm in arm with their suitors. Cynicism had built a fortress around her ribs. She didn't want their pity, and she certainly didn't want a man like Amos Weaver. But the reality of the frontier was brutal mathematics. A single woman had no land rights. Her father's claim had been repossessed by the bank. She survived by washing heavy wool blankets for the boarding house, her scarred skin cracking and bleeding in the lye water. Without a husband, she was a stray dog waiting for winter to finish her off. Up in the Bitterroot Range, winter was already threatening. Gideon Cross didn't care about the marital politics of Redbow. He cared about salt gun powder and the price of beaver pelts. He rode into town leading 2 heavily laden pack mules. The street went quiet as he passed. Gideon was a massive man wearing a coat of stitched wolf hide and buckskin trousers stained dark at the knees with old blood. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but his eyes were visible, pale sharp, and entirely indifferent. He lived high up on the jagged spine of the mountains, a place where men went to disappear or die. Most in town thought he was an outlaw. Some thought he was crazy. Nobody said it to his face. Gideon tied his horse to the post outside the assayer's office. He unslung a massive sharps rifle from his saddle and rested it against his shoulder. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, a predator stepping into a pen of nervous sheep. He needed supplies. Flour coffee, a new axe handle. And though he hadn't planned on it when he broke camp 3 days ago, he needed a wife. The cabin was too quiet. The winters were too long. A man left to his own thoughts in the deep snow eventually started answering the wind. He didn't need romance. He didn't need soft words. He needed a partner who could skin a buck and hold a rifle steady when the wolves came scratching at the door. He stepped onto the boardwalk, his boots ringing like anvils. He saw the men outside the saloon whispering. He saw a few women pull their skirts tight and step into alleys to avoid his path. And then he saw her. Nora dropped a bundle of wet laundry. The rope tying it together had snapped. Coarse grey blankets spilled into the dusty street. 2 cowboys leaned against the railing just a few feet away, laughing as she scrambled to pick up the heavy, wet wool. "Need some help there, Firefly?" One of the cowboys drawled. Nora ignored him. She dropped to her knees in the dirt. Her sleeves were pushed up, exposing the ruined, scarred flesh of her arms. She grabbed a blanket, her jaw tight, her eyes burning with a dry, furious heat. She didn't ask for help. She just worked. Gideon stopped. He watched the way her hands moved, efficient, strong, unapologetic. He watched the way she refused to look at the men mocking her. She wasn't broken. She was hardened, tempered in something terrible and completely unfazed by the dust and the ridicule. Gideon watched her haul the wet wool back into her wooden basket. The sheer weight of it made the tendons in her neck stand out. She hoisted it against her hip, staggering for a fraction of a second before finding her footing. She walked past the laughing cowboys, completely deaf to their existence. He followed her, not closely, and not with the creeping step of a thief, but with the heavy, unbothered stride of a man who owned whatever ground he walked on. He tracked her to the back of the boarding house, where the smell of boiling lye and cheap lye soap hung thick in the air. Nora threw the blankets over a thick wooden line. She was breathing hard, a sheen of sweat sticking stray strands of brown hair to her forehead. When she finally turned around to grab the next blanket, she froze. Gideon was leaning against the corner of the woodshed. He made no sound. He just stood there, a mountain of fur and leather, his pale eyes locked on her. Nora didn't scream. She didn't drop her eyes. Her hand casually drifted toward the heavy wooden wash paddle resting on the edge of the boiling vat. Out here, a lone man lingering in a back alley was a threat, and she was done being a victim. "You lost, mister?" she asked. Her voice was sharp, a piece of flint striking steel. Gideon didn't smile, but the corner of his eye crinkled. He noted her hand hovering near the paddle. He liked that. "No," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like boulders grinding together in a mudslide. "I know exactly where I am." "Then say your piece or move on. I got work." Gideon pushed off the shed. He stepped into the light. Nora saw the deep weathering of his skin, the jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the sheer imposing width of his shoulders. He smelled of pine needles, horse sweat, and wood smoke. A wild smell. "You're the Daly girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "Nora, and what's it to you? They say you've been paraded in front of half the bachelors in Redbow." Gideon didn't mince words. There was no point in small talk. Up on the ridge, hesitation meant freezing to death. "They say 7 men turned you down." Nora's grip on the wash paddle tightened until her knuckles went white. A hot flush of deep, familiar shame burned the back of her neck, but she forced it down. She raised her chin. "If you came back here to mock me, you better have a hard skull. I'll crack it wide open." "I ain't mocking," Gideon said softly. He took another step forward. He looked at her scarred arms. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away with pity. He examined the raised skin with the objective eye of a man reading a trail sign. "They turned you down because they're soft. They want a parlor ornament, someone to look pretty in the church pew." Nora scowled. "And what do you want?" "A partner." Gideon met her eyes squarely. "I live 4 days' ride from here up near the timberline. It's hard country. It kills weak things. I got a cabin, plenty of meat and a warm fire, but it's quiet. Too quiet. I need a woman who ain't afraid of blood, dirt, or snow. A woman who can hold her own when the winter hits." Nora stared at him. The sheer absurdity of it struck her. A feral mountain man standing by her laundry vat, casually negotiating for her life, as if haggling over a sack of beans. "You don't know me." "I know you dropped your laundry in the mud and didn't ask those fools for help," Gideon replied. "I know you're looking at me like you're calculating the best place to hit me with that paddle. You got grit. I need grit. I'm scarred." She challenged, thrusting her left arm forward, forcing him to look at the worst of it. "Most men can't stomach the sight of it." Gideon reached out. Nora flinched, expecting him to grab her, but he didn't. He slowly pulled back the sleeve of his heavy buckskin coat, exposing his own forearm. It was a mess of jagged, puckered skin, the unmistakable gouges of a bear's claws as running from his wrist to his elbow. "Scars just mean you didn't die," Gideon said quietly. "I ain't looking for perfection, Nora. I'm looking for a survivor." The wind kicked up, rattling the tin roof of the woodshed. Nora stood perfectly still. For 2 years she had been judged by her lack of beauty, her lack of a dowry, her lack of a soft disposition. The men of Redbow wanted a yielding vessel. This man, a stranger carved from the wilderness, was offering her an exit. Not a romance, a transaction of survival. "I don't cook fancy meals," Nora warned, her voice losing a fraction of its defensive edge. "Good. I eat stew. I speak my mind. I won't be ordered around like a dog." "I got a dog. He listens fine. I need a wife." Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather coin purse. He tossed it onto the wooden lid of the wash vat. It landed with a heavy metallic thud. "That'll settle your debts in town. Pack whatever you have. We leave at dawn." He turned away, not waiting for an answer, assuming the deal was struck. "Wait," Nora called out. Gideon paused, looking over his broad shoulder. "What's your name?" she asked. "Gideon Cross." "I ain't saying yes yet, Gideon Cross." Gideon finally smiled. It was a small, dangerous thing, completely transforming his harsh face. "You will," he said, and then he walked away, leaving Nora alone with the boiling water, the heavy purse of gold, and a choice that would tear her life apart. Dawn arrived in Redbow, with the color of a bruised plum, spilling weak light over the rooftops. Nora stood in the cramped, airless attic room of the boarding house, tying the last knot on her canvas sack. She owned 3 dresses, a pair of sturdy boots, a sewing kit, and a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to her mother. That was the sum total of 22 years of living. Downstairs, she had dropped Gideon's gold on Widow Higgins's kitchen table. The older woman had stared at the coins, her eyes wide, before looking up at Nora with a mixture of horror and vindicated cruelty. "A mountain wild man," the widow had hissed, clutching her shawl. "You're trading your immortal soul for a scrap of meat, Nora Daly. He'll bury you under the snow, and nobody will ever know." Nora had simply turned her back and walked out. Gideon was waiting by the edge of town, right where the wagon ruts faded into wild grass. He sat atop a massive roan gelding holding the reins of a piebald mare. The 2 pack mules stood behind him, loaded heavy with the winter provisions he had secured. The air was already thick with the morning heat, but Gideon wore his buckskin coat like armor. "You brought the skillet." He noted his voice scraping the quiet morning air. "It's seasoned, right?" Nora replied. She threw her sack toward him. He caught it with one massive hand, securing it to the mule's rigging with a series of sharp, efficient pulls. He didn't offer a hand to help her mount the piebald. He just watched. Nora appreciated that. She gripped the saddle horn, her scarred forearm flexing as she hauled her weight up into the seat. Her dress hiked up, showing the worn leather of her boots, but she didn't bother pulling it down. Modesty was a town luxury. Gideon turned his horse toward the looming shadow of the Bitterroot Range. "Keep her head up on the shale," was all he said before spurring his mount forward. They rode in silence. The town of Redbow vanished behind a rise of dust and dry scrub brush within an hour, and with it the suffocating weight of 100 judgmental eyes. Nora felt a strange, terrifying lightness in her chest. She had jumped off a cliff, and now she was simply waiting for the ground. By midday, the heat gave way to the sharp, biting chill of elevation. The dirt path dissolved into a treacherous trail of loose rock and sheer drops. Pines replaced the scrub oak towering above them like ancient sentinels. The air grew thin, smelling of crushed needles and cold stone. Nora's thighs burned. Her back ached with a deep, grinding throb. She had ridden horses before, but never on a vertical climb that demanded every ounce of her concentration just to keep the mare from sliding backward into the gorge. Gideon rode ahead, his massive frame swaying with the horse's rhythm, a part of the landscape. He never looked back to check if she was crying or complaining. He assumed she would keep up. When they finally stopped at twilight to rest the animals, Nora practically fell from the saddle. Her legs buckled, but she caught herself against the mare's flank, biting her lip to keep from making a sound. Gideon dismounted, pulling a canteen and tossing it to her. "Drink slow. The air up here thins the blood, makes you dizzy." Nora uncorked it, the water icy and tasting of tin. She drank, watching him uncinch the saddles. He moved methodically, stripping the gear, hobbling the mules, and gathering dry deadwood in the span of 10 minutes. He didn't ask her to fetch water. He didn't ask her to start the fire. He just did what needed doing. She walked over to the growing pile of wood, picking up a heavy, jagged piece of pine. "Where do you want the fire?" Gideon paused, looking at her holding the wood. Her scarred arm was fully exposed, the raised white tissue stark against the gathering dark. He pointed to a small depression against a rock wall. "Block the wind. Lay the stones in a half circle." Nora went to work. They built the fire together, a silent choreography of survival. When the flames finally caught, throwing dancing orange light against the stone, the bitter cold of the mountain night settled around them. Gideon sliced thick strips of dried venison and handed her a piece. It was tough, salty, and tasted of hickory smoke. It was the best thing she had eaten in days. 2 more days of riding. Gideon said, staring into the fire. "The trail gets worse tomorrow. Narrow. If the horse spooks you, let go of the reins and throw yourself towards the rock wall. You understand?" "I understand," Nora said. She chewed the tough meat, her jaw working hard. "Widow Higgins said you'd bury me in the snow." Gideon didn't laugh. He slowly dragged a whetstone down the blade of his hunting knife. The metallic scrape echoed in the quiet canyon. "The snow takes what it wants. Don't need my help for that. You keep your head, you don't panic, you won't end up under it." He sheathed the knife and stood, pulling a heavy bear hide from the pack. He tossed it onto the ground near the fire, a crude bed. "Sleep," he ordered. "We move before the sun hits the ridge." He took his rifle and walked to the edge of the camp, sitting with his back against a pine fading completely into the shadows. He was taking the first watch. Nora looked at the bare hide, then out into the absolute blackness of the wilderness. There were no walls here, no town council, just the cold, the dark, and the mountain man standing between her and the wolves. She curled into the heavy fur, the smell of wild earth wrapping around her, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept without dreaming of fire. The ascent battered them. For 2 more days they climbed into the jagged teeth of the mountains, navigating switchbacks so narrow Nora couldn't see the ground beneath her stirrups, only empty air plunging thousands of feet into blue mist. The cold turned vicious, biting through her thin cotton dress and the wool blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders. Gideon remained a stoic anchor. When the wind howled down the ravines, threatening to push the mules over the edge, he dismounted and led them by hand, his boots finding purchase on sheer icy rock where there seemed to be none. He was brutally efficient. He didn't offer comforting words when Nora's hands went numb. He simply stopped, grabbed her reins, and told her to put her hands inside her armpits until the blood returned. It wasn't kindness, it was logic. Frostbite meant losing fingers, and out here a woman without fingers was a dead woman. Late on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the trail leveled out. They crested a massive ridge lined with ancient wind-twisted spruce. Before them lay a high alpine valley, a hidden bowl of golden grass and silver streams ringed by snow-capped peaks that pierced the clouds. "We're here," Gideon grunted. Nestled against the tree line built directly into the side of a steep, rocky hill was a cabin. It wasn't a quaint homesteader's shack. It was a fortress. Thick, unpeeled logs locked together with heavy mud chinking. The roof was pitched steep to shed the winter snow, covered in sod and thick bark. A stone chimney breathed a thin, lazy line of grey smoke into the freezing air. As they rode closer, a deep, rattling bark shattered the quiet. A massive dog-part, wolf-part mastiff with a coat the colour of dirty ash barreled out from beneath the porch. He hit the end of his heavy chain with a violent snap, baring teeth that could easily crush a femur. Nora's mare sidestepped nervously. "Quiet, Scrap!" Gideon commanded, his voice slicing through the frantic barking. The dog snapped its jaws shut instantly. He dropped to his belly, whining a low, rumbling greeting as Gideon swung down from the saddle. Gideon walked to the beast, unhooking the chain. Scrap immediately shoved his massive head against Gideon's blood-stained knee. Gideon looked back at Nora. "Get down. Let him smell you." Nora swung her stiff leg over the saddle, her boots hitting the frozen dirt with a dull thud. Her knees screamed in protest. She stood rigid as the massive dog trotted over. Scrap was taller than her waist. He had one torn ear and eyes the colour of pale amber. He pushed his wet, scarred snout against her hands. Nora didn't pull away. She let him breathe her in the smell of fear, horse sweat, and wood smoke. Slowly she raised her scarred left hand and ran it over the coarse fur of his neck. The dog leaned into her palm, letting out a heavy breath. "He likes you," Gideon said, hauling a sack of flour off the mule. "That's good. If he didn't, I'd have to leave you outside." Nora wasn't sure if he was joking. She decided he probably wasn't. She grabbed her skillet and her canvas sack and followed him up the heavy wooden steps. Gideon kicked the heavy oak door open. It swung inward on iron hinges. Nora stepped over the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. It smelled intensely of tanned hides, dried herbs, and old wood ash. The space was purely functional. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. Heavy cast-iron pots hung from hooks. The floor was rough-hewn planks covered in thick bear and elk rugs. In the corner sat a heavy wooden table and 2 chairs. Against the far wall was the bed. It was a wide frame of peeled pine logs piled high with thick furs and woolen blankets. One bed. Nora stared at it. The cynical fortress around her heart tightened. This was the transaction. She had traded the humiliation of Redbow for this isolated room, and now the bill was coming due. She gripped the handle of her mother's skillet tightly, her knuckles white. Gideon walked past her, dropping the flour sack onto a heavy wooden counter. He stripped off his heavy coat, revealing a faded flannel shirt stretched tight over his massive shoulders. He turned and caught her staring at the bed. He didn't smirk. He didn't take a step toward her. He just crossed his arms. "You look like you're about to swing that iron," he said, his pale eyes reading her completely. "I told you I wasn't a parlor ornament," Nora said, her voice dropping into a low, defensive gravel. "But I ain't a whore either. I don't know how this works. I don't know what you expect." Gideon let out a long, slow breath. He walked over to the wood box, grabbed 3 split logs, and threw them onto the dying embers in the hearth. He stirred the coals with an iron poker until the flames leaped up, throwing wild shadows against the log walls. "I expect you to keep the fire going while I check the trap lines." Gideon set his back to her. "I expect you to help me salt the meat so we don't starve in January. I expect you to shoot anything that tries to break down that door while I'm gone." He turned around, leaning on the poker. His eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the panic and the defense mechanisms she had built in town. "I bought a wife because a man goes insane talking to the trees, Nora. I brought you here to build a life, not to conquer you." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the firs. "You sleep on the wall side. It's warmer. I take the edge. And unless you invite me, I don't cross the middle. We clear." Nora let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 days. The tension in her shoulders cracked a sharp, physical release. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man surviving at the edge of the world, offering her the exact same courtesy. "We're clear," Nora said. She finally set the skillet down on the stove. Gideon nodded once. "Good. Now peel those potatoes. We got an hour of daylight left and I need to bleed the mule." He walked out the heavy door, thudding shut behind him. Nora stood alone in the center of the cabin. The fire crackled, pushing the bitter cold back into the corners. She looked at her scarred hands, tracing the raised white lines. For the first time in years, she didn't feel broken. She rolled up her sleeves, found a rusted paring knife, and went to work. Routine became her anchor. In Redbow days had been measured by the ringing of the church bell and the sneers of passing townspeople. Up on the ridge time was dictated by the angle of the sun and the ever-present threat of freezing. Nora adapted to the brutality of the mountain with a grim, relentless energy. She learned quickly that hesitation meant a cold hearth or a ruined meal. By her 3rd week, the soft skin on her palms had vanished, replaced by thick, yellowish calluses that finally matched the rough texture of her scarred left arm. Gideon was a man of infuriatingly few words. He did not issue orders. He simply began a task and expected her to mirror him. When he dragged a freshly killed elk into the clearing, blood steaming in the frosty air, he handed her a skinning knife with a bone handle. He didn't ask if she had a weak stomach. He made a clean incision down the belly, peeled back a section of the heavy hide, and stepped aside. Nora swallowed the rising bile in her throat, knelt in the blood-soaked snow, and mirrored his cuts. It took them 4 hours. Her hands cramped. Her back screamed. The metallic smell of hot blood clung to her hair for days. But when the meat was finally hanging in the smokehouse and the hide was stretched on a wooden frame, Gideon poured her a measure of harsh rye whiskey from his private jug. He clinked his tin cup against hers. It was an initiation. She had passed. They lived in a synchronized silence. They bumped elbows in the small kitchen space, sharing the warmth of the stove. They ate heavy stews of root vegetables and venison, the only sound the scrape of spoons against tin. Yet the silence wasn't empty. In town, silence meant judgment. Here it just meant there was nothing broken that needed fixing. One evening late in October, the wind shifted, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of an approaching storm. Gideon sat by the hearth, carefully packing paper cartridges for his sharps rifle. Nora sat at the table, a heavy iron needle pushed through the thick leather of a torn saddlebag. The oil lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the log walls. "You favor your right side when you chop wood," Gideon said suddenly. Nora paused, the needle stuck halfway through the leather. She looked up. Gideon hadn't stopped measuring black powder. He hadn't even looked at her. "My left arm doesn't pull the same as it used to," she replied, her voice defensive. "The fire tightened the tendons. It works fine." "It throws your balance off," he said calmly, capping his powder flask. "You swing from the shoulder instead of the hips. You're going to tear a muscle in your back doing that. Then I'll have to chop the wood and do the cooking." Nora's jaw set. "I pull my weight." Gideon finally looked at her. His pale eyes caught the lamplight. "I didn't say you didn't. I'm telling you how to survive the winter without crippling yourself." He stood up, walking over to the table. He stood behind her chair. "Stand up." Nora hesitated, then stood. Gideon moved close, the sheer size of him dwarfing her. He smelled of gun oil and pine sap. He reached down and picked up the axe handle resting near the door. He handed it to her. "Hold it." She gripped the smooth ash wood. Gideon stepped behind her. He didn't hesitate. His large, rough hand settled over her hips. Nora went completely rigid. It was the first time he had touched her outside of passing a plate or a tool. His grip was firm, impersonal, yet heat radiated through the thin cotton of her dress. "Your power comes from here." Gideon grumbled, his voice rumbling in his chest, vibrating against her back. "Plant your boots shoulder width." Nora shifted her feet. "Now." Gideon continued, his hands moving up to her waist, turning her torso slightly to the right. "When you swing, you twist the core. Let the weight of the axe head do the work. Stop trying to force it with your arms. The scars don't matter if your foundation is solid." He stepped back immediately, taking the heat with him. Nora stood there, gripping the axe handle, her heart hammering against her ribs with a strange, frantic rhythm. She looked over her shoulder. Gideon was already back at his chair, picking up another brass casing. "Tomorrow you chop a cord using your hips," he ordered. "If your back hurts, you did it wrong." Nora slowly lowered the axe. She looked at his bent head, the thick, dark hair brushing the collar of his shirt. "Thank you," she muttered. Gideon didn't look up. "Don't thank me. Just don't break your back." Later that night, the temperature plummeted. Nora lay on her side of the heavy bed, staring at the ceiling beams. The wind screamed outside, battering the thick logs. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. True to his word, Gideon lay on the far edge of the mattress. He slept on his back, his breathing deep and even. A foot of empty space separated them, a cold, deliberate gulf. Nora pulled the heavy elk hide tighter up to her chin. The cold was seeping through the chinking. She closed her eyes, but the ghost of his hands on her hips lingered, a phantom warmth in the freezing dark. He was a hard man. But he was the first man who had looked at her scars and simply taught her how to work around them. Winter did not announce itself. It kicked the door in. The first week of November brought a blizzard that erased the mountains in a wall of blinding white. The snow fell thick and heavy, burying the cabin up to the windowsills within a day. On the morning of the second day, the snow stopped, leaving a deceptive, razor-sharp blue sky. Gideon laced up his heavy winter boots. He had checked the sky, checked the wind, and decided it was time to clear the closest trap lines before the powder froze into a crust. "Keep Scrap inside," Gideon instructed, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. He strapped on a pair of wide, teardrop-shaped snowshoes. "Keep the fire hot. If I ain't back by nightfall, bar the door." Nora stood in the doorway, A heavy woolen shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The air was so cold it burned the inside of her nose. "Will you be back by nightfall?" Gideon paused, looking back at her. His beard was already catching frost from his breath. "Plan on me not being." He turned and pushed his way into the deep drifts, his wide strides quickly eating up the distance until he vanished into the dark line of spruce trees. Nora shut the heavy door, throwing the iron latch. The cabin felt instantly larger, hollowed out by his absence. Scrap whined, pacing in front of the door before flopping down on the rug by the hearth, his chin resting on his massive paws. She kept busy. She split wood using her hips, feeling the satisfying bite of the axe head sinking deep into the pine without straining her arms. She baked a heavy loaf of soda bread. She mended a tear in Gideon's spare trousers. But as the afternoon wore on, the sky turned the color of old iron. The wind returned. It started as a low whistle through the roof slates and escalated into a deafening roar. The temperature dropped so fast the moisture on the inside of the window panes froze into solid white sheets. By dusk, the storm was fully enraged. It was a whiteout. A man couldn't see his own hand an inch from his face in that blowing snow. Nora sat by the fire, her stomach tied in cold, heavy knots. Night fell, plunging the cabin into a suffocating gloom. She threw another log on the fire. Gideon was not back. Hours bled away. Scrap grew restless. The massive dog stood by the door, the hackles on his back raised, letting out a low, continuous growl that vibrated in his chest. Nora stood up. She grabbed the heavy iron poker. "What is it, boy?" Scrap snapped his jaws, barking once a sharp, aggressive sound directed at the heavy oak door. Nora's blood ran cold. The wind was howling, but beneath it she heard a sound that made her breath hitch. A heavy, desperate scratching against the outside wood. "If I ain't back by nightfall, bar the door." She backed away. It could be a starving cougar. It could be a bear pushed out of its den by the storm. Then came a heavy, muffled thump against the lower panels. Scrap lunged forward, barking furiously, scratching at the latch. Nora froze. Scrap wouldn't try to break down the door to attack a predator. He wanted to get to the other side. Dropping the poker, Nora ran to the door. She grabbed the heavy iron bar and threw it back. The wind violently ripped the door from her grasp, throwing it open and instantly filling the cabin with a swirling vortex of snow and freezing air. A massive shape collapsed over the threshold, hitting the floorboards with a heavy thud. Nora screamed against the wind, throwing her weight against the door to force it shut. She slammed the iron bar into place, cutting off the deafening roar of the storm. She spun around. Gideon lay face down on the floor, covered in a 2-inch layer of solid ice. His snowshoes were gone. His rifle was gone. "Gideon." Nora dropped to her knees. He didn't move. Scrap was frantically licking his master's frozen face. Nora grabbed Gideon's heavy shoulders, using every ounce of her strength to roll him over. His face was a terrifying shade of grey. His lips were blue. His eyelashes were frozen shut. Panic threatened to choke her, but the brutal practicality she had learned over the last month kicked in. Survival was mathematics. If she panicked, he died. She grabbed his frozen boots. The laces were encased in ice. She ran to the kitchen counter, grabbed the bone-handled hunting knife, and slashed through the heavy leather laces. She ripped his boots off, then his frozen socks. His toes were waxy and white. Frostbite. She hauled him toward the hearth, pulling him by the collar of his coat until he was inches from the roaring fire. She sliced through the buttons of his frozen coat, stripping away the icy layers until he was down to his flannel shirt. His skin was violently cold to the touch. Nora grabbed a rough wool blanket, throwing it over him. She ran to the stove, poured hot water from the kettle into a tin basin, and grabbed a rag. Gideon let out a low, ragged groan. His eyelids fluttered. "Don't you die on me!" Nora hissed, her hands shaking as she pressed the warm, not-boiling rag against his frozen cheeks. "You arrogant bastard, you don't get to buy me and then die in the snow!" Gideon's chest heaved. He opened his eyes, the pale irises glassy and unfocused. He looked at her face, then at the fire. A violent shiver racked his massive frame, his teeth clacking together audibly. "Fell." He forced out his voice, a broken rasp. "Ravine." "Shut up," Nora ordered, rubbing his hands vigorously between hers. "Save your breath." It took 2 hours of relentless work to bring his core temperature up. She forced hot, heavily sugared tea down his throat. She rubbed his feet and hands until the terrifying, waxy whiteness gave way to an angry, painful red. By midnight, the violent shivering had subsided into a deep, exhausted tremor. Gideon was lying on the rug, staring blindly at the flames. He couldn't walk. Nora stood up, her own muscles aching with exhaustion. She dragged the heavy mattress off the bed frame, hauling it across the floor until it was situated directly in front of the hearth. She rolled him onto it, covering him with every pelt and blanket in the cabin. She sat in the chair watching him, but within an hour the tremors returned. The fire wasn't enough. His body had burned through its reserves. Nora looked at the mattress. She looked at the heavy gulf of space Gideon had always maintained. The mathematics of survival were absolute. A fire warms the skin. Body heat warms the blood. She stood up, unlaced her boots, and slid under the heavy pile of furs. She didn't stay on the edge. She moved directly into the center, pressing her back flush against Gideon's broad, shivering chest. She wrapped her scarred arm over his torso, pulling him tight against her. Gideon stiffened for a fraction of a second, his survival instincts fighting the sudden contact. Then, with a heavy, broken sigh, his arm wrapped around her waist. He pulled her close, burying his freezing face into the crook of her neck. They lay there in the dark, the storm raging uselessly outside. The boundary line was gone, not crossed by desire, but erased by the simple, profound necessity of keeping each other alive. Sunlight pierced the frosted glass like a shattered blade, casting fractured light across the heavy floorboards. Nora opened her eyes, her face buried in the rough wool of a blanket. The cabin was freezing, the fire having died down to grey ash hours ago, but she was entirely warm. A heavy arm lay draped across her ribs. Gideon's chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm against her spine. She didn't move immediately. She lay still, listening to the wind screaming over the roof slates. The violent shivering that had racked his body had stopped. She slowly slid out from under his heavy arm, the sudden absence of his heat hitting her like a physical blow. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and stood up. Gideon's face had lost that terrifying grey pallor. He was pale and completely exhausted, but breathing normally. His toes, though blistered and painfully red, were no longer the waxy white of dead tissue. He would keep his feet. Nora didn't waste time on relief. She crossed the small room, grabbed a handful of dry kindling, and struck a sulphur match against the stone. Within minutes she had a roaring fire, pushing the chill back into the corners. She fetched fresh water, breaking the ice in the wooden bucket with the heavy handle of her knife, and set the iron kettle to boil. Only then did she look back at the mattress. Gideon's eyes were open. They were bloodshot and tired, tracking her every movement from the floor. He didn't say a word as she poured hot water into a tin cup, added a heavy pinch of salt and brown sugar, and walked over to him. "Drink," she ordered, kneeling beside the mattress. He pushed himself up on one elbow, wincing as the bruised, stiff muscles in his back stretched. His massive hand shook slightly as he took the cup. He drained it in 3 long swallows, the hot liquid bringing a sudden flush of color to his thick neck. He handed the cup back, staring at her hands. "I lost the rifle in the drift," he rasped, his voice raw from the cold. "I'll dig it out when the wind dies." "You saved my life." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, stripped of any pride or male ego. "You would have done the same," Nora replied flatly. She turned away, moving to the counter to slice the leftover soda bread. "I'm a mountain man, Nora. Surviving is my trade." He shifted his heavy weight, pulling the furs up to his waist. "You're a town girl. You were supposed to panic. You were supposed to freeze." Nora paused, the bread knife resting against the hard crust. She looked over her shoulder, her scarred arm resting on the cutting board. "I stopped being a town girl the day they looked at my hands and decided I was dead weight. I told you I ain't weak." Gideon stared at her, the quiet intensity in his pale eyes burning right through the lingering chill in the room. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. "No, you ain't." For the next 3 days, the dynamic of the cabin inverted completely. Gideon was confined to the mattress, nursing bruised ribs and severely frost-nipped feet. Nora took over. She chopped the wood outside her hips, snapping with the motion he had taught her, ignoring the burning ache in her shoulders. She fed Scrap, throwing the massive dog-frozen chunks of elk meat. She strapped on Gideon's spare snowshoes, waded into the waist-deep drifts, and spent an hour digging until she found his Sharps rifle buried near the tree line. She cleaned the weapon at the table, oiling the action until the lever snapped shut with a satisfying metallic crack. Gideon watched her from the bed. He watched the way she moved, efficient and unapologetic. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't ask for guidance. She simply assessed what needed doing and did it. On the 4th morning, Gideon swung his legs over the side of the mattress. He tested his weight on his battered feet, biting back a grunt of pain. He stood towering in the small room once more and walked to the stove where Nora was frying salt pork. He didn't speak. He reached out and wrapped his large, calloused hand over her right hand, stopping her from turning the meat. Nora froze her breath, catching in her throat. Gideon turned her hand over. He looked at her palm. The soft skin was gone, replaced by thick, yellowish calluses from the axe handle and the rough ropes. He ran his thumb over the hardened skin, a strangely intimate gesture. Then he looked at her scarred left arm. He didn't trace the burn marks. He just acknowledged them. "You earned your place here," Gideon said quietly. "This ain't my cabin anymore. It's ours." He let go of her hand and walked to the door, pulling his heavy coat off the peg. He was still limping, but his strength was returning. Nora watched him walk out into the snow. The transaction was dead. Something far deeper, far more permanent had taken its place. She looked down at her calloused palm, feeling the lingering warmth of his touch. In Redbow, a man's touch had always been a prelude to violence or a clumsy attempt at pity. Gideon's touch was an anchor. It was the rough, unpolished respect of a man who measured worth in blood and sweat. She turned the salt pork, the fat popping and hissing against the iron skillet. Widow Higgins had warned her she was riding to her grave. Instead, she had finally found the ground where she could plant her feet. Deep winter locked the Bitterroot Range in a frozen grip. By January, the snowpack was 8 feet deep, transforming the cabin into a buried fortress. They tunneled out the front door, creating a narrow trench lined with sheer white walls that led to the woodshed and the smokehouse. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the distant echoing cracks of freezing timber. They settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. Gideon's limp vanished. He spent his days checking the near trap lines, returning with fox and marten pelts. Nora stretched and scraped the hides, her scarred arm moving with a relentless, driving force. The long, dark evenings were spent by the roaring fire. Gideon carved new triggers for his traps. Nora mended gear. They didn't talk much, but the silence was no longer an empty void. It was a shared, comfortable wait. Then the mountain brought a different kind of storm. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was the color of bruised slate, promising another foot of powder. Nora was at the stove boiling down a pot of deer bones for marrow broth. Gideon was at the table sharpening his skinning knife. Scrap was dozing by the hearth. Suddenly the dog's head snapped up, his ears pinned flat against his skull. He didn't bark. He let out a low, vibrating growl that rattled the tin cups on the shelf. Gideon stopped grinding the blade. He set the whetstone down softly. He didn't rush, but every muscle in his massive frame went tight. He stood up, picked up the Sharps rifle resting against the log wall, and jacked a heavy paper cartridge into the chamber. The metallic clack was deafening in the quiet room. "Stay behind the stove," he murmured, moving towards the door. Nora didn't cower. She picked up the heavy iron fire poker, gripping it with both hands. Heavy, dragging footsteps crunched in the snow trench outside. Someone kicked the bottom of the heavy oak door. It wasn't a knock. It was a demand. "Open up!" A voice rasped, raw and desperate. "We see the smoke. Open the damn door." Gideon didn't unbar the latch. He stepped to the small, heavily frosted window pane and wiped away a circle of ice with his thumb. 3 men stood in the trench. They were half-starved, wrapped in filthy, ragged buffalo robes. Their faces were blackened with frostbite, their eyes wild and sunken. Drifters. Men who had stayed too late in the high country, trapped by the snow, turning feral in the cold. They carried rusted repeating rifles. "We ain't taking no for an answer," the lead man shouted, slamming the butt of his rifle against the wood. "You move on!" Gideon's voice boomed through the heavy logs, calm but vibrating with violent intent. "There's nothing here for you. We know you got meat." A second man screamed, his voice pitching high with panic. "We ain't dying out here." The lead drifter took a step back and leveled his rifle at the door lock. Gideon moved faster than a man his size had any right to. He stepped back, raised the Sharps, and fired directly through the heavy oak planks. The blast shook the cabin. Wood splinters exploded inward. A scream echoed outside, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the packed snow. "You son of a bitch!" the second man yelled. Gideon was already reloading, his thick fingers moving with terrifying speed. "Next one goes through the window." Nora didn't wait. She moved from behind the stove. She didn't have a rifle, but she had the boiling pot of marrow broth. She grabbed the heavy cast iron handles with her thickly calloused hands, ignoring the searing heat bleeding through her cloth grips. She moved to the door, standing completely out of the sight line, but right next to the frame. "We got you outnumbered," the third drifter yelled, though his voice shook. "We're coming in." 2 heavy impacts hit the door simultaneously as the remaining men threw their shoulders against the wood. The iron latch groaned. The wood splintered around the hinges. Desperation made them strong. "Nora, get back," Gideon commanded, raising the rifle again. The door crashed inward, ripping the iron bar from its brackets. 2 ragged, desperate men spilled into the cabin, bringing a blast of freezing air with them. The first man swung his rifle up, aiming blindly toward Gideon. He never pulled the trigger. Nora stepped forward, swinging the heavy iron pot in a brutal arc. The boiling, greasy bone broth hit the man squarely in the chest and face. He dropped his weapon, screaming a high, unnatural sound, clawing at his boiling skin as he fell backward into the snow. The second man froze, staring in horror at his agonizing companion. He looked up, locking eyes with Nora. She stood over him, holding the heavy, dripping iron pot like a medieval weapon. Her scarred arm was fully exposed, muscles coiled tight, her eyes burning with a savage, unrelenting fire. She looked entirely feral, a creature forged by the harshness of the mountain. "Get out of my house!" Nora said, her voice dropping into a low, vicious gravel. The man looked from Nora to Gideon, who had the heavy barrel of the Sharps leveled directly at his chest. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled backward, grabbing his screaming companion by the collar and dragging him out into the snow trench. They stumbled over the dead body of their leader, scrambling frantically towards the tree line, leaving a trail of blood and panic in the snow. Silence crashed back into the cabin, broken only by the wind howling through the open doorway. Nora stood perfectly still, her chest heaving, the empty pot dangling from her hands. Scrap barked wildly, jumping over the threshold, snapping at the bloody snow, but Gideon whistled sharply, bringing the dog back inside. Gideon walked to the doorway. He looked down the trench, verifying the drifters were gone. He looked at the dead man bleeding out in the snow. Then he turned and looked at Nora. She expected him to reprimand her. She expected him to tell her she had been reckless, that she should have stayed behind the stove. Instead, Gideon reached out, took the heavy iron pot from her shaking hands, and set it on the floor. He lifted his hand, his thumb wiping a speck of hot grease from her cheekbone. "You ruined a good batch of broth," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. Nora let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline crashing through her veins. "I'll boil another pot." Gideon's mouth twitched, the closest she had ever seen him come to a full smile. "You do that." He turned, grabbed the dead man by the boots, and dragged him away from the door. Out here there was no law to call, no sheriff to report to. There was only the mountain, and the mountain dealt with its own. Nora watched him work, realizing with total clarity that she was no longer a cast-off from Redbow. She was a survivor standing shoulder to shoulder with her equal. Winter released its grip, slowly fighting every inch of the thaw. Ice jammed the roaring creek below the ridge, snapping thick pine trunks as the rising water violently overran the banks. Heavy mud replaced the white powder, pulling at their boots with a cold, sucking weight. The cabin roof leaked, demanding constant patching with pitch and sod. They worked harder in the spring than they had in the dead of winter. The heavy oak door, splintered during the drifters' attack, had to be completely rebuilt. They spent 3 days planing raw pine planks, the mountain air sharp with the scent of fresh sap. They worked in perfect tandem. Gideon held the heavy wood steady. Nora drove the iron nails home with a heavy hammer. They didn't need to speak to find the rhythm. The sink was bred deep into their bones now, forged by necessity and cemented by respect. Meat had to be heavily smoked. Winter hides had to be tightly bundled, and a small garden plot had to be hacked out of the rocky soil behind the woodshed. Nora's cotton dresses were completely ruined. She wore a pair of Gideon's old canvas trousers, cinched tight at the waist with a braided leather belt. Her scarred arms were permanently exposed to the warming sun, browning deeply. The raised white tissue blended into the tough, weathered skin around it. She caught her reflection in the creek one afternoon while scrubbing a skillet. The frightened, defensive girl who had stood humiliated in Redbow's mercantile was completely gone. The woman staring back had hard, calculating eyes, a sharp jaw, and hands that knew exactly how to kill and how to heal. Inside the cabin, the invisible boundary line on the mattress had vanished. Since the night of the blizzard, the deliberate gulf between them had steadily closed. It wasn't discussed, it was just accepted. A calloused hand resting on a knee near the fire, a broad shoulder deliberately brushing against hers in the cramped kitchen. By March, they slept completely tangled in the heavy furs. Gideon was a furnace in the dark, and Nora found herself gravitating to his chest the moment the hearth banked low, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart. May brought the first true heat. It also brought clear mountain passes. Gideon saddled the massive roan gelding on a Tuesday morning. He loaded the 2-pack mules with tightly bound pelts, fox beaver, and marten. The furs were prime taken in the deepest cold. They would fetch a small fortune down in the lower valley. Nora stood on the rough wooden porch, wiping bear grease from her hands with a scrap of burlap. She watched him check the cinch on the lead mule, pulling the leather strap tight. Town is a 4-day ride. Gideon said, not looking up from the rigging. I'll sell the furs, buy salt sugar coffee and enough flour to get through next winter. He walked over to his saddlebag, unbuckled the heavy leather flap, and pulled out a familiar pouch. It clinked heavily in his grip. He stepped forward and tossed it onto the porch steps. It landed right at Nora's mud-caked boots. Nora looked down at the gold. It was the exact same pouch he had thrown onto Widow Higgins' wash vat 8 months ago. "Passes are open," Gideon said, finally meeting her eyes. He hooked his massive thumbs into his gun belt. "That's half the season's take. More than enough to buy a stagecoach ticket out of Redbow. Go east, St. Louis, Chicago, places where folks don't care about a scarred arm or a small-town council's gossip. You earned your share. You don't owe me a damn thing." Silence stretched between them, heavier than the thick spring mud. Nora stared at the pouch, then up at the towering, battered man who had pulled her out of hell and dragged her to the very edge of the world. He was giving her an exit, a clean, undeniable break. He wasn't demanding she stay. He was proving in the only language he knew that he didn't own her. She stepped off the porch, her boots sinking deep into the wet earth. She bent down, picked up the heavy leather pouch, and walked directly up to him. She didn't hand it back. She grabbed the front of his faded flannel shirt with her free hand, twisting the tough fabric tight in her fist. "You think I fought off starving drifters, froze half to death, and chopped 2 cords of wood just to go sit in some stuffy parlor in St. Louis?" Nora asked, her voice a low, furious rasp. Gideon didn't move. His pale eyes searched her face, watching the fire flare in her gaze. "I think you have the right to choose." "I chose 8 months ago." She snapped. She shoved the heavy bag of gold hard against his chest. "I ain't a passenger, Gideon Cross. This is my claim as much as yours. You think you can get rid of me that easy?" Gideon looked down at her fist twisted in his shirt. He looked back up at her fierce, unyielding expression. A slow, genuine smile cracked through his heavy beard, completely transforming his rough face into something devastatingly human. "No," he rumbled softly. "I don't reckon I can." He dropped his hands to her waist, pulling her flush against him. There was no hesitation this time, no boundary of survival dictating the touch. He kissed her. It wasn't soft. It tasted of strong black coffee and wild wind, rough and fiercely demanding. Nora answered it with the exact same feral energy. She dropped the gold straight into the mud, wrapping her scarred arms around his thick neck, anchoring herself to the only man who understood the exact weight of her soul. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. "I need a list for the mercantile." Gideon murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "Buy garden seeds." Nora whispered back. "And a heavier axe. The ash handle is splintering." Gideon laughed, a deep, resonant sound that bounced off the ancient pine trees. He stepped back, picked up the muddy pouch of gold, and shoved it deep into his coat pocket. He swung up into the saddle, settling his weight with a heavy creak of leather. 4 days down, 4 days back, Gideon told her, gathering the reins. "Keep the dog inside at night. Cougars are trailing the deer herds. Just make sure you bring the coffee back." Nora replied, crossing her arms over her chest. She watched him ride down the winding trail, leading the mules into the dark line of spruce. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly where his home was, and he knew she would be there guarding it when he returned. Nora picked up her dirty rag, wiped the mud from her boots, and walked back inside her cabin. The fire needed stoking. If Nora and Gideon's journey from outcasts to true equals kept you hooked, hit that like button and let me know in the comments below. Did Nora make the right choice, staying on the brutal mountain, or should she have taken the gold and headed east? Your thoughts make these stories come alive. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow frontier romance fans and hit subscribe so you never miss a tale of survival grit and rugged love. The wild is unforgiving, but so are the hearts of those who tame it. See you in the next one.